Welcome to the National 5 RUAE Revision PowerPoint. You'll find here an explanation for every kind of RUAE question for National 5 that you could possibly encounter in the prelim or the exam. To use the PowerPoint, simply first click play on the megaphone symbol to begin the audio explanation on any given slide. Then left click or use your spacebar to bring up each aspect of the question in turn, which is referred to in the audio. Alternatively, please find on the YouTube channel for Douglas Academy, under English Department, a seamless version of this presentation in which you can simply press play and watch all of the question types in turn. The first kind of question we're going to be looking at is an in your own words question, in which you paraphrase or gloss the words from the passage, putting them into your own words. Here the passage is from an article by Jason Diamond at the Literary Hub. In it he discusses why cats in bookshops are ubiquitous, or in other words, why cats tend to be found in so many well-loved independent bookshops. When I walk into my local bookshop, the first thing I do, after saying hi to the owners, is look for the shop cat, Tiny the Mini Master. Tiny is the photogenic spirit of the place, who gives you approximately 5 seconds to impress him. Otherwise, he goes right back to sleep on that pile of 19th century novels. The question is this: explain in your own words why the first thing the writer does when he visits his local bookshop is to look for the shop cat Tiny. You should make 2 key points in your answer. The first thing to do for an in your own words question, before we put pen to paper and start to worry about our final answer, is simply to find the answer in the passage itself and underline or highlight it. We can see here there are a number of bits of information that we could choose to put into our own words for our final answer. Now, when it does come to putting pen to paper, what we should do is simply express the information we've identified, glossing or paraphrasing it, or in other words, using our own words. We must remember, of course, not to change the original meaning. Here we've got a number of possible answers we could have given. The cat seems to be the boss of the place. That's a gloss of Mini Master. Tiny is an attractive cat. That, of course, is a paraphrase of photogenic. We could have said that Tiny is the heart and soul of the shop, glossing the fact that he's the spirit of the place. Here's another example of an in your own words question. This is an extract from an article from The Times, in which journalist Matthew Said recalls bonding with his childhood friend Mark over their shared love of football. Mark never made it into the school team. He kept trying, kept going to the trials, both at primary and senior school, but he was just off the pace. The disappointment was always bitter. You could see it on his face. He yearned to play, to progress, to be able to read out a match report at school assembly, one of the honours of making the team, but he never did. The question is this: explain in your own words why Mark was so disappointed. You should make 4 key points in your answer. Once more, when it comes to highlighting or underlining the parts of the passage that we could choose to put into our own words, or gloss or paraphrase, we notice that there are always more possible answers to be drawn from the passage than number of marks that we can possibly be awarded. In other words, although this question is only asking for 4 marks, there are more than 4 possible answers to give. Here we can see we could have said, Mark was never picked. He persevered when opportunities arose. He was not quite skilled or fast enough. We could also have said he longed to be part of the team, he wanted to improve his performance, or he desired a moment of glory. Now once more, the final 2 marks are in red just to stress that we only need 4 for this particular question, although more than 4 possible answers could have been given. It's a good rule of thumb to identify in the passage more answers than are required, so if you find that you're finding one particular point challenging to put into your own words, you can fall back on some other options. Moving on to a word choice question, we're looking once more at the article by Jason Diamond in which he discusses the ubiquity of cats in bookshops. Egypt, where cats are believed to have been first domesticated, is also where the relationship with bookshops can be traced. While mainly used to keep rodents away from homes and crops, cats were trained to keep pests away from papyrus rolls, which contain texts. Without cats, in fact, it's hard to imagine how Egyptian civilization could have so successfully weathered the diseases and famine caused by vermin. But also imagine the knowledge that might have been lost were it not for those four-legged protectors guarding the temples from tiny intruders. Here's the question. Explain how an example of the writer's word choice makes it clear that cats played a very important part in preserving Egyptian writing. 2 marks. The first part of the formula for a word choice question asks us simply to quote the word we wish to examine. Here we can see a couple of possibilities of what we could have chosen: trained or pests. Then we've got to comment on the connotations of the word, or in other words, what the word makes us think about. We should think of 2 or 3 connotations. Here we can see some connotations of trained are being obedient, useful, and helpful. We certainly think of those words too when we try to understand in greater depth the usefulness of the cats. Now, the last thing we've got to do is explain what these connotations suggest. We could have said something like this. This suggests that the ancient Egyptians were able to teach cats how to help keep papyrus rolls safe. There we have our 2 marks for each of the parts of the formula I've just discussed. And here we can see another possible answer we could have given for the very same question, this time referring to the word pests. Let's move on to an imagery question. Once more, we're going to be looking at the football article by Matthew Said. The majority, like Mark, never made it through the first lap. Others made it to the final straight before dropping out. But this is football, this is life. Failure is an inevitable aspect of any competition worthy of the name. Without losers, there cannot be winners. Without pain, there cannot be joy. Without natural selection, there cannot be evolution. Failure is not the opposite of progress. Failure is part and parcel of progress. Here's the question. By referring to a language feature, explain how the writer makes clear his view about competition. Of course, one such feature of language that we can choose to talk about is imagery, and that's what we'll be doing in this case for our 2 marks. It's important to remember that imagery, as the name suggests, paints a picture, and it does so by means of either metaphor, simile, or personification. Therefore, what we've got to do first of all for an imagery question is quote and identify the type of image. Once more, is that metaphor, simile, or personification? Here we can see we could have said first lap or final straight, both of which are examples of metaphors. There's our first mark. For our second mark, we've got to say, in the first instance, how the 2 similar things being compared in the image are similar. We should include the literal meaning and use the phrase just as so too. In this case, we could have said, just as in races, the winning runners overtake the rest, so too only the best players make it to the Premier League. The latter half of that sentence, of course, is spelling out the literal meaning of the image. We're not literally referring to a race, but rather a football game is being likened to a race figuratively in order to bring out the sense of competition that we find there in both sports. Last but not least, we should explain why the image is effective, using the phrase, this is effective because. This is effective because it shows how competitive football is, as we've already said. There's our final mark. For our first example of a punctuation question, we're going to be considering a BBC News article by John Newton about the time when McDonald's and fast food first became an everyday part of British life. We can see here the extract reads, "It is 1975. UK cinemas are showing an advert for a brand whose name at this point is principally linked in the national consciousness to a nursery rhyme farmer. To the viewer, golden arches means nothing. A Big Mac is just an oversized raincoat. Our question for this punctuation example is this. By referring to one example of language, explain how the writer makes it clear that McDonald's was unfamiliar when it first came to the UK. We should, of course, note that a possible 2 marks can be awarded for this question. Therefore, on the next slide, let's go through what to do for each of these marks. For a punctuation question, what we must first do is identify the sentence type, pattern, or punctuation mark that we're going to be writing on. In this extract, we can see there are 2 examples of inverted commas being used. We can see them highlighted here, golden arches and Big Mac. For our answer, let's focus on Big Mac. What we've got to do is write down what punctuation we've identified, what kind of punctuation do we see in other words, along with a quotation from the passage showing this punctuation. Then, last but not least, what we've got to do is explain the effect of this punctuation. We can see here that the use of inverted commas suggests that because the product was new to the British public, they would not have recognised the name. We might find it helpful to approach a tone question by remembering that the tone of a piece of writing is almost like the voice in which it's read, if you can imagine the writer reading their work aloud. Is it sarcastic? Is it happy? Is it mournful? How would you read it aloud if you wanted to do justice to how the writer intended those words to be received? Once more, here we're looking at the article by Jason Diamond about the ubiquity of cats in bookshops. Today, when we think of a cat chasing a mouse, it's usually in some cartoonesque Tom and Jerry sort of way. The dumb cat is always foiled by its tiny adversary, like we're supposed to forgive the little pests for gnawing on our possessions and spreading disease. It's unfair. The question, explain how an example of language makes it clear that the writer is defending cats here. The first thing we should do for a tone question is identify the parts of the passage where the tone is expressed. Notice for my first bullet point I'm writing down that it's tone I'm looking for, because if you remember, the question asked us simply for a feature of language. So we're simply spelling out that tone is that feature that we're looking for in this case. And the parts of the passage we've honed in on, where that tone is shown, is this phrase here, like we're supposed to. For these first 2 bullet points, we've got our first mark. Then what we've got to do is, by referring to techniques such as word choice, sentence structure, imagery, and so on, show how the writer creates this tone. What I've said here is, this creates a sarcastic tone, using word choice to suggest that mice do not actually deserve our forgiveness. Now, we've already encountered questions where we've been asked to identify simply examples of language, and we've chosen to, for example, look at tone. These slides on use of language questions will reiterate the idea that for a use of language question, we're free to identify many different aspects of language. We've already mentioned tone, but we could also look at sentence structure and imagery, for example. Therefore, you should treat this kind of question as an opportunity to draw on your skills that you've got as regards other question types. Once more, we're looking at the article by John Newton about McDonald's. This is the memory of a present-day McDonald's customer, Chris Hammond, a West Midlands man born in the 70s and raised in the 80s. These were Haileycon days for those who remember the brand when it was new, and Britain was a thinner and some would say healthier nation. Chris gives an estimate of mid-80s for his first McDonald's visit, but it was not until, as a late teen in the 90s, that he used a space-age drive-through with its electronic ordering of goods via disembodied dialogue overseen by teens in caps. Here's the question. By referring to two examples of language, explain how the writer makes it clear that a visit to McDonald's could have seemed strange. For each two examples of language, 2 marks can be awarded, therefore giving us 4 marks in total. Let's look at the first example of a use of language that's evident in this passage. We've got to quote and identify the technique, whether that's word choice, sentence structure, or imagery, for example. Here, I've chosen space age. This is an example of sentence structure. By writing down space age with the inverted commas there that indicate it's an example of sentence structure that's being used to give a certain effect, I've written those two things down for my first 2 bullet points and therefore gotten 1 mark. For my final bullet point, and accordingly my final mark, I've said that inverted commas are used to suggest that it was unusual to have a dining experience that reminded you of science fiction. You'll have noticed that we also highlighted disembodied dialogue as being another example of an effective use of language that we could draw attention to. This, of course, is an example of imagery. For our first 2 bullet points, we've got disembodied dialogue, in quotation marks, and imagery. There's our first mark. For our second mark, we've pointed out that it's a metaphor, and we've said that the metaphor is used to illustrate how the voice at the drive-thru seemed to be coming from nowhere. Note that the same level of detail and depth that's required for an imagery question in the strict sense is not required here. Next, we're going to be looking at a link question, which, as the name suggests, concerns a part of the passage and how that part of the passage relates to the article generally. Once more, we're going to be looking at the article by Jason Diamond concerning cats and bookshops. Bastet, the deity representing protection, fertility, and motherhood, could turn herself into a cat, hence the popular idea that Egyptians worshipped them. It's pretty obvious that cats haven't really moved on from the sort of treatment they received in the time of Pharaoh. They carry themselves in a stately manner and demand that you treat them with a certain amount of reverence. Notice that the question points out the part of the passage in particular that we're to look at and explain how this part of the passage links to other parts. Here's the question. By referring to the sentence, "It's pretty obvious" of Pharaoh, explain how it helps to provide a link between the writer's ideas at this point in the passage. 2 marks. Now, don't be intimidated by the fact that there are more steps for this formula than perhaps for other examples of RUAE questions. All we're doing for a linking question is explaining on the one hand how the part of the passage we've been asked to look at links back to earlier in the passage, and on the other hand, how that very same part of the passage links forward to what's yet to be said. First of all, we should quote briefly from the linking sentence or paragraph. Here I've given the sort of treatment they received in the time of the Pharaoh. Then, we should show how that quotation makes a link back to earlier in the section. I've said this links back to when the author discusses how cats were sacred in ancient Egypt. There's our link back and our first mark. Now, moving on to the link forward. Once more, we should quote briefly again from the linking sentence. Here I've given cats haven't really moved on. We can see that this links forward to when the author discusses how cats are still treated with reverence today. There's our final point and our final mark. The final RUAE question type we've got to look at for National 5 concerns effective introductions or conclusions. The principle is the same in each case, whether you're considering an introduction or a conclusion. We're going to look at the article about McDonald's for one last time. It was typical of those early fast food experiences, confusion, newness, and thrill all at once. It sounds like love, or at least loving it, but loving it, now in a different century, where eating habits have certainly changed, has brought with it another cultural shift, a growing awareness of how and what we eat. The question is this: explain how this extract contributes towards the passage's effective conclusion. 2 marks. You may have guessed that the first thing we've got to do for this type of question is simply to provide a quotation from the introduction or conclusion that we wish to comment on. Here we can see we may have chosen those early fast food experiences or confusion. After having given that quotation for your first bullet point and your first mark, what you next must do is explain how the author is introducing or concluding a main idea which is carried through the whole piece of writing. Because we're concerned with a conclusion, what we're trying to identify is how the writer rounds off or brings to a head a central idea of the passage. We can see here that an answer we could have given in regard to the quotation we've chosen is this concludes the idea that McDonald's was a completely new thing for Britons when it first came to the UK in the 80s. That's our second bullet point and our second mark. And we can see how in that response we've said how that idea is carried through the entire piece and rounded off nicely in the conclusion. Now, of course, we've already got our 2 marks of the maximum 2 marks that can be awarded for this particular question, but nonetheless, let's explore an alternative answer that we could have given. We'd already mentioned that confusion seems to be an appropriate quotation to choose to comment on. After having given that quotation, in explaining how the author is concluding a main idea of the passage, we could have said, this concludes the idea the fast food way of eating took a lot of getting used to for McDonald's new British customers.